Hey everybody, how you doing? It's Brian, and welcome to the For Us Therapeutics Podcast. I'm Dr. B,
I'm Dr. Lakeith.
and before we get into today's topic, I would like you to like, comment, subscribe, share this video with somebody so that way we can give as much free information back to the community as we possibly can. So, getting into today's episode, I'm excited to talk about this topic because today's episode is going to be titled "Are You Black Enough?" Because recently, over the past couple of weeks, I've had a couple male clients who grew up in well-to-do neighborhoods in the suburbs. Their parents moved them from the hood because their parents lived in the actual hood and moved them to the suburbs, and they had a different lived experience. And now they feel as though they struggle with connecting to the black community. They feel like they're not black enough, and I want to unpack that just a little bit. The black identity. So I'm gonna open up the floor to Dr. Keith. Like, Dr. Keith, when it comes to the black identity, we had talked about this off camera before we went on here.
Yes,
when
we did.
you think about the black identity or the black experience, what comes to mind for you?
Well, thinking about the black experience, and I will focus more so on the African American experience. As much as I hate to say it, two words that come to mind, and they both mean the same thing: adversity and struggle. Okay. Now, that's not to say that that is the only part of the black experience in America, but it is definitely a reoccurring theme throughout it. And oftentimes makes me kind of wonder, like, what would black people be like if we didn't have those struggles? Like, who are we outside of our struggles, outside of that historical trauma? Like, who would we be? How would we define ourselves?
That's fair. So when I think about the black experience, we had talked about this before. I think because my clients say they don't feel like they're black enough. I do think that struggles involved, but I also think about, are they thinking about criminality, like being tough, being willing to fight, not taking no crap from nobody, things like that. Because the reason why I find it very interesting is because what does it really mean to be black, right? Like, for instance, there's a societal perception of black people. And I can't help but think about Dr. Amos Wilson's book, The Criminalization of the African American, right? How they take our deviant behavior and put it under a magnifying glass and use it for entertainment, to glorify it, to put it in the media, right? And in his book, he gave a really, really good breakdown of, in order to justify the way that America treats the African American, you have to criminalize them. That way you can give it a sense of, well, they deserve what they're getting. They're naturally criminals. They're naturally deviant. So whenever I hear that from my clients who say, like, am I black enough? That's what comes to my mind. That's why I think, like, are you associated with the struggle? Are you associated with living in the hood? Are you associated with, like, living in the projects? Like, what is the connecting piece? Because I agree with you, right? Like, what could we have been? What could we have been if we weren't always associated with being less than, being criminals or things like that? I don't think that we are. I don't think that we should be placed in that one box. However, though, I do recognize that that is the thing that society equates us to. That's the thing that society tends to glorify from us. Literally, when NWA came out with gangster rap, it hit hard and it just took over.
Yeah.
It literally hit hard and took over, and then that became the mainstay. But I am curious to get your thoughts on something. So when you say this struggle, right, what are we talking about when we talk about struggle in the black community?
Okay, when we are talking about struggle in the black community, that big R word, racism. This system of race, this practice of race has always been the lens to which we have had to look at ourselves if you are someone who is black. And as you mentioned earlier, talking about the justification of being able to treat black people, that also becomes like another lens to look through, because the fact that in America, it's always been this thinking of, oh, well, in order to be able to, in order for black people, I should say, in order for us to justify how we're treating black people or how black people are problematic or whatever, we have to come up with this narrative, right? So, for instance, one can argue that slavery, the justification of it, right? Well, how do you justify putting another human being in bondage? Well, you look at them and their differences, as you mentioned, as far as like, oh, their deviant behaviors, which I'm always kind of interested when people use that term, as far as like, well, what are we defining as deviant? But that's a whole nother conversation. It becomes this justification as to like other Black people, as in like, yeah, we're white, but they are other, right? And those others become the reason why, like, okay, there's a justification to look at Black people in a certain way, and look at Black people a certain way out of its proper context. And by that, what I mean is looking at us outside the context of our culture and how we see it and how we experience. And not to mention the fact that when we're talking about, as you mentioned, that whole notion of criminality, and particularly when you gave the example of NWA, I always view NWA as this groundbreaking group that articulated a frustration of a community of Black people who have often been disfranchised and had a very complex and unhealthy relationship with how they were being policed, having a very complex and unhealthy relationship with economics, with housing. And they just articulated that rage in a way that spoke to us that we could understand it. It's just that more so, unfortunately, because of the fact that it articulated anger, it got looked at as like, well, see, look at that anger, look at that frustration. They're dangerous, they're angry Black men. And it's like, well, yeah, the angry Black men who have, over the course of generations, been put in situations to where as though violence, drug distribution is an option because it feels like it's the only option. So when I say struggle, I say all of these, and this is the word that I know y'all get sick of me saying in podcasts, but it's the truth. A system that has put Black people in certain situations, certain lifestyles, or certain places to where as though they're responding in the way because that's what that system has dictated. Hey, this is where you're going to be, so you respond accordingly. So, for instance, if we're talking about being authentically Black and it becomes a situation of like where you live and how you grew up, in my mind, and this is just my thinking, we grew up in places where we were intentionally put there to grow up and view ourselves and view each other that particular way.
No, I would agree with that. So when I think of struggle, I can rationally know that racism plays a factor, right?
Yes.
And when you talked about systems of being people being placed certain places, yeah, that's why you have projects, and public housing was like one of the biggest things that crippled the Black community, right? So when I thought of struggle, I literally did jump to the struggle of poverty and trying to survive. So when I think of the Black experience and equate it to struggle, me and you have talked about it. We grew up in Section 8 housing. As a matter of fact, our family goes back, 10 generations, Keith, in D.C.? 8 generations in D.C., right? And me and you have lived in some real tough places, right? So when I think of the Black experience and when it came to mind with the word struggle, I thought about when we were living in Section 8 housing, right? And the interesting thing about it is yes, racism is definitely a factor. There's no but with that. With that, I want to say is this. When I say that some Black people don't feel like they're Black enough, I'll never forget this. When Dad sold the house and we ended up moving to Fort Washington, right? Before I get to that point, for anybody who's listening to the podcast that doesn't live in the Washington, D.C. area, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia all touch each other, right? When we were growing up, this is how Brian, not saying it's the truth, how I created struggle. When we ended up in certain places we lived at, I thought that every version of Maryland and Virginia was the suburbs. I didn't care where you live. If you lived in Maryland and Virginia, you lived in the suburbs.
Unless you lived in Baltimore.
Right. Unless you lived, but I didn't, at the time we were young, I didn't even really know too much about Baltimore because that was too far down the road.
Oh, I know plenty about Baltimore.
Right. So I always thought that was the suburbs, correct? And I based it upon our cousins who lived in Oxon Hill because think about it. They owned their house. We didn't own ours for a little bit, right? Living in Section 8 housing. So when our dad sold the house in Northwest D.C. and we ended up moving to Fort Washington, I started to see some of the people that lived out there. And Fort Washington is a very, very nice development. So when I ended up moving out there, I was like, y'all don't know what struggle is. Y'all own your house. Y'all don't have food stamps. Y'all don't have to worry about like when money's coming in. So to me, when I hear the word struggle or being Black enough, that's the thing I jump to, and I don't necessarily agree with that. Like you don't have to struggle to be authentically Black. That's why I like the way you broke it down with struggle is connected to the racial experience that we have to go through. And it is system-based, right? Because every Black person is going to experience racism. Whether it's overt or covert, we're all going to experience it. So going back to my example, that's why, like, when we come across people, and this is no shade to nobody, when they tell me about the hoods of Maryland when we were growing up, I just couldn't see it in my head. Like, you live in Temple Hills, your District Heights. If you owned your own house, that wasn't a struggle to me. But you got to look at it in the context of where me and you come from. So when I say struggle and not being black enough, that's instantly where my mind goes to. I'm not saying it's right. And I feel bad because I don't think that nobody should feel that they're not black enough because they didn't live that type of struggle. But what do you think?
I think that when we're talking about struggle, the one thing that we don't talk about is the fact that it's not monolithic.
Right.
It looks very different in different spaces and different places. And also, struggle changes over time and it changes with generations. So, for instance, during the era when we were growing up, we were really, because we grew up in the city, D.C. proper, we grew up with the impression that, like, if you lived out in suburban Maryland, whether it was Montgomery County, Prince George's County, or if you were across the bridge in Virginia, that somehow or another there was a certain level of comfortability that came with that. Because the fact that you, as you mentioned, you owned your home. You went to a school that was rated as being good, and all the things that come along with suburban living.
You didn't have to worry about food stamps or EBT cards.
Exactly. But one thing that we didn't necessarily understand was the fact that, okay, because even though people may have these things, maybe they're struggling to maintain them.
Correct.
And also not to mention the fact that people have a great way of masking things, as in, like, you know, you have this lovely home, but you, like, house poor. House poor. Thank you. As in, like, you got a nice house, but there's not too much you can do because you have, like, this crazy mortgage. And struggle changing over time, and also speaking to the power of gentrification, evolves and makes spaces that once were, that we had deemed like, okay, this is not a place of struggle, to now be in places of struggle, because all the places that you have named in Prince George's County, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, but the data does shows that over the course of this last maybe 2 decades, there has been a shift in demographic in regards to income. What was once a community where maybe you had a lot of families who were making 6 figures are now communities of people who are either right at the poverty line or falling below the poverty line.
Correct.
Which, of course, can be contributed again to what's going on in D.C. and how people are getting pushed out. So struggle evolves. Struggle isn't just this one thing. It's not going to look the same for you and me. It's not going to look the same for a group of people in the whole entire auditorium. But in the weird way, and that's the funny thing about struggle, there are certain similarities. Like when we all, for instance, I won't even give a struggle example. I'll just talk about this. I love when Black millennials get together and we sit down, we talk about like Uno. And we talk about the different ways we play Uno, because it gives a certain level of commonality, right? Even if you played it different ways, you play numbers, you play colors, whatever it was, you understand like, oh, what that experience is like to do that. Struggle is similar in that same way to where as Black people, when we get together and we talk about, man, I grew up in the Marcy Projects in New York City. And it's like, oh, well, I grew up in Berry Farms in D.C. Well, I grew up in Capri Green in Chicago. Different environments, but there's a similar struggle there as far as like going without and trying to figure out, okay, so how do I make $1 out of 10 cents?
Correct. And that's the Black experience I think that people connect to being Black enough. And I don't necessarily agree that needs to be the foundational experience for you to be Black enough, right? Because as you said, like the statistics are bearing out that the demographics of quote unquote that level of struggle, it's changing, right? Yeah. Like the DC that we knew growing up is in many ways still similar, actually.
It is. I would say that, but if you look at statistics right now, it's feeling like the 90s.
Yeah, there are certain parts that don't look the same as it did when we were growing up.
Yeah.
But like the economics of everything, the gentrification, as you said, is shifting where Black people are finding themselves. So yes, there are certain places that while once were thriving, are going to look impoverished, or were once impoverished are going to look thriving. But what I'm getting at is I do think that the Marcy Projects, the Berry Farms, and what was the Chicago? Caprini Greens. That is the quote unquote Black enough experience that people associate with being Black enough. And for me, it's kind of like as I listen to these people, right, as two people who grew up in rough areas in the city, I don't agree that you need to live that life to be Black enough. Like,
agreed.
You don't have to live in pissy apartments, you know, be desensitized to gunshots, because all that leads to complex trauma. Like, for instance, when I say, I'm going to use this as an example when I relate it to complex trauma, is that when you live in certain neighborhoods, you live by those rules. Like, using that system thing that you're talking about. Society has rules of engagement as far as behavior, what's acceptable behavior.
Yeah.
Then your community has them. Then your family has them. Then you have your own individual rules. So for those people who live in the hood, one thing I've learned that when working with clients and even with myself is that disrespect is non-tolerable.
Correct.
Cannot handle disrespect because it can cascade into everybody trying you now, right?
Yeah.
So when I say that black experience that we're talking about, right, where you don't quote unquote feel black enough or not, disrespect is a non-tolerable thing, no matter whether you're Caprini Green, Marcy Projects, or Berry Farms, right?
Facts.
So when I'm confronted with somebody being disrespectful, but you're trying to emulate this hood lifestyle, if me and you don't have the same rules, you're going to feel that I'm taking it too far. Where I'm not taking it too far, I'm following the rules to where now you're like, now you're doing too much. I'm not doing too much. You're not doing enough. But when I say connect that to complex trauma, I mean, the more you're in a certain environment, the more you activate a way of living. But that way of living doesn't carry over into every environment. Hence why people who tend to grow up in that lifestyle struggle when they get to other environments. And I'm going to bring it all together in a nice bow. That's why I don't think that struggle lifestyle needs to be that you're black enough. Because the struggle lifestyle produces a certain way of thinking and a certain way of behaving that doesn't transfer over into adulthood, corporate world, building relationships outside of your community, because you can't take those same rules with you, and those rules shouldn't be the foundation for everything, is what I'm getting at.
No, it's true. And I like this topic because it is very nuanced, because I think when you flip it over, I think it's also black people doing what it is that we've always historically had to do, which is we have to find some sort of empowerment from a situation where like there wasn't much power. So I think that when people get into these dialogues about like, man, this is how I grew up, it was tough, I think that it's our way oftentimes of saying like we ourselves are also tough, as in we are also survivors. Like, I have overcome, like, granted, I may even still be living in the thick of it, but I'm still here and I'm still standing. Or we wear it as a badge of pride to show people that we're not ashamed of what it is that we've been through or where we've come from. Or we do it as a way of letting people know, yo, if I survive that, I can survive this. Right. So don't mess with me. I think we just try, in some instances, to really use this as a way of like something negative, turn it into something positive so it can empower us to make us feel as though we have some sense of strength or control in the situation that we just don't. And then the other part of this conversation is when people feel that way, I often kind of pause and ask myself, well, are we having a more in-depth conversation about the broadness of what it is to be black? Because I feel as though if the default for some or even many is to equate blackness with this idea of survival and just struggle, which we can't deny that is a part of the experience, then I feel as though we're not focusing on a very rich history that comes with a lot of things, that comes with like a lot of intellectualism, scholarship, that comes with a lot of creativity, that comes with a lot of bravery. And if that is the case, then I often think to myself, because as you mentioned with your clients, I often think to myself, well, how are we addressing that, as far as like how are we making sure that black people, when they grow up, they understand that this experience of being black is a very broad thing and there isn't just one way of being black, and how we have those more robust conversations about blackness, and also giving people the space to define their blackness, which my last point also speaks to another part of this too, which is, right, we haven't been really given enough room or space or opportunity for ourselves individually to define what being black means, right? It's just been more so kind of like this collective thing, because we've always been forced to do things or think about things when it comes to ourselves as a collective. And I know that also that's a lot to do with our American experience, but I also understand that in a lot of African cultures, you think as a collective. But for us, it has like this weird experience or this weird component to it where it's like we think as a collective, to where as though, and I know a lot of y'all going to feel this when I say this, where we see a black person doing something embarrassing.
Yeah, they feel like they embarrassing all black
we
people.
We feel as, oh my gosh, you are embarrassing us, right? And we feel that way. And that also, again, makes me think to myself, like, how many of us are given the space to be able to recognize that, like, look, just because this person who is the same color as me is behaving this way, and maybe that's a reflection of who they are and their particular version of blackness, which I'm not saying is right or wrong, does not necessarily mean that this has to reflect upon me and who I am in my particular form of blackness.
No, I agree with that. And I want to go back a little bit. Like, I recognize that there is a struggle to being black. And I don't want nobody to think that I'm disregarding that struggle. My thing is, I don't want that struggle, or it's better to say this. I'm concerned that that struggle is what defines being black, even just to black people. Like, if you didn't live in a hood, if you didn't grow up in the projects, if you weren't living a certain lifestyle, then you're not quote unquote black enough. I don't think that is a good thing for us. So I acknowledge that is a struggle for many, but I don't think that foundation should be the defining feature of, if you didn't do this, you're not black enough, because there are different levels of struggle, like you said. And to your point, I agree. It's one of those things where it's, when one white person does something embarrassing, it's not you making all white people look bad. They don't really care.
Exactly.
Granted, context and history play a factor in that. But black people, we do think collectively as a group. When one black person does something wrong, he's making us all look bad. Don't nothing like, I mean, black people come together and be like, when we hear a crime and they haven't released the race of the person, we be like, man, I hope that wasn't a black person. You find out that it was, we be like, whew.
Or depending on the crime, we'd be like, oh, they not black.
Yeah,
They're
correct.
not black.
We do think collectively, and we don't give ourselves enough space to think, as an individual singly. Because when people from Florida do something stupid, I know he's probably black. But I know that he don't represent all black people, and no disrespect to people from Florida, but people from Florida, they just wilding out here. They're acting a little bit different. But to your point, yes, I don't think that should be the foundation of it, because going back even further, I think that our criminal side of who we are as a community gets glorified too much. Hence why I brought up NWA. You're right. NWA was a group of people who were also articulating their struggle with policing and housing. But let's be real. Eazy-E was also talking about what he really did in the streets, for good, bad, or indifferent. Society grabbed hold of that and ran with it to where, like, you are only going to see the promotion of a certain group of artists.
Yeah.
Certain group of black artists that they're going to glamorize and glorify drug dealing, killing, and stealing, even if that is the truth of the reality where they came from. Whereas in other groups, and I'm going to steal from Dr. Umar Johnson for this one.
I felt this
and
coming.
in other groups,
I felt this coming.
In other groups, like for instance, the glamorization of the Italian mob in movies is different than the glamorization of the criminal lifestyle of black people, right?
Correct.
Matter of fact, I don't even want to just say that. Like the gangs of L.A., a famous black group that got together in order to protect themselves, they're portrayed differently than you would see like a Japanese Yakuza, a Chinese triad, or an Italian mob. I think that they take hold of one image of who we are and like, this is who black people are.
Yeah.
And my concern, keeping it all together and succinct with the podcast, is that I don't think that should be the actual experience that makes you black enough, because Italians don't go, yeah, if you weren't part of the mob, you're not really Italian. No, Italians go, well, your mom and dad from Italy.
Well, you're not wrong in that. So I think that when you are any minority group in this country, because of whatever your experiences may be, you look at certain experiences as a key indicator of like, hey, okay, you understand what this particular experience is. And I get what you're saying, and 100% agree as far as like, it shouldn't just be rooted in this particular struggle. Right. And that becomes like the place from which we kind of view ourselves and our authenticity and our blackness. But I also, to your other point, I talk about the mafia and the mob, I also recognize the fact that when you are of a lighter hue, you definitely are able to get a broad range of what it is to be an Italian. And I do believe that Italians do actually maybe have some things that's kind of like, oh, well, if you didn't do this, or you didn't experience this, you didn't eat this, or your mother can't make this, you're not authentically Italian.
Oh, I agree with that. Like many Puerto Ricans say, because my team leader in the Army was Puerto Rican. He said there's a difference between Puerto Ricans in New York and then Puerto Ricans on the island. Puerto Ricans in New York will rep the Puerto Rican flag, but they've never been to the island Puerto Ricans from the island kind of look down on them a little bit, like, but you ain't never seen Puerto Rico, so what are you talking about? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So every culture has that. I just think that which you were speaking to, the uniqueness of what it is to be Black, and you only get pushed one image of yourself in media as a struggle. Which, for instance, because since you mentioned Dr. Johnson, I'll mention a conversation we had the last time we recorded. It's like a reason for right now when we're talking about music, particularly hip hop. Right now, it's just like, and particularly focusing on female rap, we get one version or one narrative of female rappers, and that's not to invalidate any of those lovely ladies or their experiences or what they're talking about. But the problem is the fact that is just one form of Black femininity based off of a certain circumstances of life. It doesn't give us a broader hip hop form of Black women to where so it could be more expansive, to where so if you didn't get this one representation, you wouldn't feel so like, and I hate to say it because again, no offense to those artists, you wouldn't feel so cringy because it's a case of like you have a lot of Black women watching these other female artists and it's like they are a representation of themselves, and no disrespect to that, but they're not necessarily a representation of me.
No, and you to that point, you're touching on what I'm getting at, right? Like you have Sexy Red is the hottest female rapper out right now. There's no way around it. She just is. Whether you like her or not, that's the nature of it. Is she the hottest rapper out now because she sells more than everybody? Female rapper out right now because she sells more than everybody? Probably so. Could they go and get more different people to market? They probably could, but they choose to go with her because it's the thing that generates money. But my thing is also to what you were saying is that they took Sexy Red and made her like, bam, this is the standard of quote unquote female rap right now. But the thing is, people don't look at it as that's just entertainment. They look at it and go, nah, this is Black women.
See, okay, putting all the other races to the side who look at Sexy Red, right? I'm focusing on our community. Even to this day, it always bothers me the fact that when we see a Sexy Red, that we can't just look at it and say like, that's just a depiction of this particular Black woman, right? But for us, it's a case of when we see it, we either fully embrace it because it's like, yeah, that's my experience, or we fully reject it because it's a case of like, no, this is just an experience of Blackness that's highly based off of whoever you are, your value systems or morals, highly problematic. And it always amazes me as Black people when we don't recognize like our buying power, and not even just buying power as in like the money, but buying power as in buying in. And this is not saying that this needs to happen for Sexy Red, but if it's a situation, if most of us did not necessarily prefer her image or her sound, it's a case that we have to buy into it. Now, granted, I understand that it's not that simple because of the fact that, well, there's a white audience that probably streams her music more. But it's a situation to where, so if we as a community were more so in a place where it's like, nothing against old girl, but that's just not a representation that we just want to focus on, it wouldn't necessarily become a primary focus. But because we don't necessarily recognize that we have like that buy-in power with our money, but also that buy-in power with our attention, we just kind of still feed into it. Because we feel like there's no other option, or we don't have any other options.
I don't think it's not that we don't have any other options. I think that Sexy Red is lit. That's just what it is. She's entertaining. So that's why she's buying into it. But to your point, even if I agree with you that Black people aren't aware of their buy-in power to get things done. I think that we're not aware of it, but also we put our money in frivolous things that we don't need to put our money in. Like we don't, as in the Black community, we don't see value in creating our own schools. We don't see values in creating our own rec centers. We don't see any value in those things, but we see value in consumer products. That's what we see value in, right? So I say that to say this. Black people are buying Sexy Red albums because Sexy Red is the hottest female rapper out right now. But to your point also, even if we didn't, that image that's being thrusted forward, it's not even just for us, right? Not even, when I say us, I mean Black people. The world is going to look at said Sexy Red and be like, this is what the Black community represents, because historically that's just how it's always been. And the reason why that's an issue, nothing against Sexy Red, but every Black person has probably heard from a race outside of our own go, well, I mean, look at how y'all depict y'all women. It comes up. Look at how y'all depict y'all community.
Which is funny because it's a situation where it's kind of like, well, one, we're not really doing the depicting. Yes,
Correct.
don't get me wrong.
To your point, that's exactly it. We are not doing the depicting at all. But it's one of those things where even though it's just entertainment, it's actually used against us.
Yeah.
And to the point of what we're talking about, there are certain depictions that are placed under a magnifying glass and blown up for entertainment to where now outside of our community, they think this is who we are. Inside of our community, we're like, this is who I'm supposed to be. Or I'm not black enough if I'm not this.
Yeah.
You know, or it's not exciting if it's not that.
Yeah.
To my point is where I'm like, I don't think that, I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't want people to think that if you're not living this hyper magnified lifestyle, that doesn't make mean you're not black enough, because why can't a black boy who lives in the suburbs and plays the violin and gets straight A's, why is he not black enough?
He is.
Exactly. To me and you and anybody else listening, they may feel that way, but to some people it's like, nah, you're not black enough.
I think,
like, why are you black enough? For instance, if you can't do a hand-to-hand, does that mean you're not black enough? Matter of fact, there's somebody listening right now that don't even know what a hand-to-hand exchange is. That is when we swap out cash with drugs on the slide so no one can see it, right? But why does that need to be, oh, okay, yeah, he black enough.
Okay, here's the thing with that, right? I think that a part of that is also the fact that, because I think we're talking about a combination of a couple of things. By that I mean it's this. I think that, I can't think of the proper phrase for it, but I'll just say it in the most layman's terms, which is this. I think that the glamorization, as you mentioned, of a certain lifestyle of blackness has been completely blown out of proportion.
Yes.
So whereas though that I think that even black people feel as though when they see it, that is what blackness is, and not necessarily realizing that that's just a particular form of blackness based on a particular set of circumstances put in a particular environment, to whereas though it doesn't broadly represent all of blackness, which is why, of course, as we talk about role representation matters, it does, not even just in the sense of just have like this one black person on there, but a diversity of black experiences, of black families, of black identities. And also, because whenever we have these conversations, I also realize the classism that's involved in them, because I never want to denigrate anybody if it's a situation it's like, well, all they do is all they're doing in that community is selling drugs and gun violence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. For the simple fact that, like, it's not that simple. It's more complicated than that. But I think that when, of course, we recognize and start celebrating broader, and not even just us, society as a whole, a broader image of blackness, then those become less of an issue. But to also say this, everything we discuss, I think honestly, that is the nuances or the broadness of the struggle. Because even if it's a situation where you are the student who plays the violin that lives in the suburbs, you get straight A's, one of your struggles is still going to be the fact that if you go out into the broader world, there's going to be a certain perception of you. So that's the reason why, like, when we talk about that whole blackness, not I'm talking about struggle, I'm talking about the fact that even if you go to Harvard and you get a law degree, that's not going to protect you from certain struggles you're going to have to face when you go out there and you find out you're maybe I think it's about only 4% of lawyers are black. It's not going to protect you.
No, I agree with you.
You're still going to run into some sort of struggle. But I think at the same time, though, with saying that, I'm sorry, because I'm not articulating myself very well today because I didn't have coffee, is that I wish oftentimes when we're talking about, authenticity, and it becomes this conversation about struggle, and maybe even the struggle Olympics, not necessarily taking the time to kind of pause and think, but wait, how are they struggling? Just because there's a class difference and there's an educational difference or there's a financial difference, how are they struggling and where they are in their particular space? And I know also, and again, because I feel bad whenever I talk about struggle, because I also recognize that blackness is not just associated with struggle. I don't want that to be the case, but
that is the perception, though.
But that is the perception. But here's the thing,
because that's what
that's the odd thing about it. It is the perception, but it's also very much a reality. No matter what level you are.
Yeah, we talked about that in the beginning. So that is the perception. I'm talking about the perception more in our own community as opposed to external. But the external part plays a factor, because you said it yourself. When you become a lawyer or you become a doctor, me and you are two doctors. That daggone doctorate degree don't protect us from when we got to interact with white people. That's the external part, right?
It does not.
But internally, the perception, and I'm talking more internally, and I'm basing upon meeting with our clients. Internally, there is a perception of a struggle that's associated with, or if you didn't struggle enough or a certain level, you're not Black enough. And I brought this to this podcast because I think that we need to talk about that as a community, because that's odd. Like, for instance, I don't know anybody in the hood who I've met recently who was in that lifestyle that doesn't tell younger people, look, if you don't need to be this way, don't be this way. Like, that's where I'm getting at. Like, there's this weird thing, like, from the people who don't live in the hood, look in, they think that I need to have that. And I'm not trying to make a blanket statement for everybody. It just appears that way. I didn't have that real experience, so I'm not quote unquote Black enough, right? While there are people that grew up in the hood, even me and you, even though we may not have been a part of that lifestyle, we were there. And as I said earlier, I operate under those rules because when you live in that neighborhood, you walking around, you got to know those rules and operate accordingly.
Yeah.
I'll never forget this. I use it as an example and I'll make it quick. I'll never forget when I was 16 or 17. I was outside with one of my friends. His name was Colin. And Colin, if you ever see the show, shout out to you. We were both teenagers. Yeah. This dude, I forgot his name. He's like 24. He came up, started messing with me. And I gave him a warning. I said, if you try me one more time, you have to see me about it. He tried me one more time. In my mind, I know I wasn't going to beat this person. But I had to set a precedent right then and there. Because if I let you get away with this, I got to deal with everybody else. I'm not going to say I lost. It broke even, or he slightly won, one or the other. So then, I might have lost. But at the end of the day, it's one of those things where I took that mindset and applied it to everywhere else. I'm not going to let you try me, right? Yeah. And what I'm getting at is there's a perception when you're inside the hood that, at one point, you should be proud of where you come from. Yeah, I grew up here. I grew up in Marcy Projects, grew up Berry Farms, grew up in all these tough places. I made it out there. I can make it everywhere. But after a while, you get to a place where if that's not you, you don't need to be that way. And it's this weird thing from the outside looking in and the inside looking out, where there's this weird association where you got to have this thing, this form of struggle to be considered Black enough. And I guess at this grand age that I'm at now, is like, I think that that's doing harm. Because the reason why I think it's doing harm is there are people who, as we go forward in generations, because the access to wealth, right? You ain't gonna find too many, like, well, you will always find a hood everywhere. But think about it. The Gen Zs, these are suburban kids. Most of them are, right? They're suburban kids. Their parents might have been in the hood, but they're suburban kids. Look at T.I. and King. Well, like, look at T.I. and King. T.I. is a multimillionaire. King is a rich kid, but he wants to be that way look at Ja Morant. Look at them. They are so far removed from it that King's response is, I stayed at my grandma's house. What does it matter? You don't have to be that way. So don't be that way. And that's where I say, like, what is Black enough? Why can't the Black kid, why can't King have grown up, went to a good school, became well educated? Why couldn't him doing that been Black enough? Well, here's the thing. You got to make this succinct because we got to wrap up.
Oh, no. Here's the thing with that.
Never mind. Keep going. The producer said keep going, so you keep going.
Okay. No, here's the thing with that, right? So in King's situation, he did have the option. Of course, I don't like to speculate in regards to whatever it is he chose and why he chose it, because I'm one of those people who's kind of like, look, I would have to sit in a session with you two to hear what it is you have to say.
I'm glad you. I'm so sorry, but I do want to say this. Yeah, if you didn't grow up in the hood and you run to the lifestyle, that is wild to me.
I will agree.
That's wild to me.
I agree 100%, but I think some of that also goes to a place of, as you mentioned, like this idea of what authenticity is and what Blackness is, and particularly if you're young and you're trying to figure yourself out in your identity, you run towards something, whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing. And in that instance, I think it's a case of people running towards the wrong thing. But also, because when you said like Gen Z, and particularly some of them being suburban kids, definitely think about Gen Z in the context of suburbia and some of the things that are happening. But also think about our kids right now that's still living in the city and still struggle in a lot of ways that I think a lot of us who grew up in the city, no matter what area you were in, still struggle. And again, that empowerment piece, as far as like, you got to find something to make you feel strong, something to make you feel powerful in situations where that's just not really the case. So you take ownership of your struggle and say like, well, this is what I deem to be, an authentic Black experience, which to me is always bizarre and funny in all these conversations, because I think maybe something we should share. What makes someone authentically Black? What makes them not so Black? It's just something I was thinking of. And for me personally, to answer both of those questions in one statement, for me personally, I consider you to be authentically Black when you take pride in Black history. Pride. Thank you. Sorry. Slurred that word. Take pride in your culture, in your history.
I agree.
I think you're authentically Black when you're able to talk about the history in a very nuanced way. Because it always tickles me when I run into Black people who have not, and it's not their fault, who have not been educated on Blackness or Black history. And I'm not even just talking about our babies who are growing up in poverty. I'm also talking about our babies who are growing up in affluence, who, if I throw out anything that isn't Martin Luther King, wealth and affluence.
Man. I say that because someone told me, like, we got to cut down on using the big words.
Well, wealth. If it's not anything outside
I'm not saying we have to.
I know.
But it was recommended.
But I know. Look, I want to make sure I'm speaking in a way that everybody understands what we're saying. And I know you guys are all smart. If it's anything outside of Martin Luther King, or if it's anything outside of the typical but still important Black figures that get thrown out during February,
Right.
Most of our young kids, they don't have a full understanding of what it is to be Black, or more importantly, not even what it is to be Black history. As in, I literally had a child tell me that if they went, a teenager, when they graduated, if I went off of what they taught me about Black history in high school, it would have been, we were slaves, Martin Luther King freed us.
No, I agree with you. Like, that to me is a more authentic Black experience of taking pride in your community and knowing who you are. I agree with that. And while you were talking about that, it brought something to mind, right? Because it's one of those things where, and I actually want to say this, is kind of like, I'm always surprised by how much I learn from 50 Cent. As we get older.
That's random.
I'm always surprised by how much I learn from him, because 50 Cent, and I want to say Joe Budden has said it as well. Like, there's hardly any parent. I'm not going to say there's no one, but most parents who grew up in the struggle do not want their kids going through that. Like, you don't got to be that way. 50 Cent famous line was like, if you read his book, Hustle Hard, I forgot the name of it. It was a really good book too. But anyway, the book where he teaches you how to be a mogul, he says in the book, and I'm paraphrasing, be you. If this isn't you, do not do it, because you don't need to do it. You just need to be you. That's why I said, going back a little bit, I think it's wild to grow up in the suburbs, to grow up in a good family, good neighborhood, to run to hood lifestyle. The reason why I think it's wild is because, and I'm going to use 50 Cent as an example, and what I said earlier, it ain't what you think it is. There are rules that you have to follow. And I often say this to a lot of people. This isn't a movie. If you don't follow them right, there's no one to go cut in scene. No. It can get out of control really, really fast. Hence why I say, like, you don't got to run to it. And to your point, I think that if we put a more different spin, which I feel like millennials forward have been, like even the previous generation, what is that? Gen Xers? Is that the ones before?
Gen X.
I think like they've been doing a good job with it as well. Like, you don't got to do that lifestyle to be considered Black enough. Because, like I said, I'm going to give them their flowers. Joe Budden, I want to say it was Joe Budden. I know 50 Cent has. They've talked about it like, you don't got to do that. Like, you don't have to. If it ain't in, you don't got to do it.
See,
I think that's why, people get irritated. Especially people who've done that. They get irritated by, like, King and Ja Morant of the worlds, because it's like, that ain't you. You don't have to do it. But you're doing it because, I don't want to speak for them. It seems like you're doing it because you think that that's what needs to be done to be Black. You got to do this. Like, you got to live that lifestyle to be portrayed or be respected as a Black person. I mean, you just don't.
Yeah.
Like, what is it? It ain't.
Well, my whole thing when we're talking about this is, and to put a pretty bow on it, is that it always boils down to, like, okay, exposure. Exposure by that I mean saying that really giving a platform for all the blackness and all its many forms to be able to be front and center and be able to be represented. Because I think one of the biggest things, and the sad thing is we do it both in our community, but also society as a broader does it too. We limit ourselves in regards to like what it is to be black. There's a reason why like I love having the topics because they're good topics, but I hate having those type of conversations about oh well such and such, they're not really black because the fact that whatever the experience was. And kind of having to pause them and say like, well, that's not necessarily the case because they're very much black and very much proud, but just because they grew whatever background they may have had, that's still a form of blackness. I think only time you lose your, and this is just me, I'm not policing black people, but at the same time I am. You lose your blackness when you want to disassociate from it.
I agree
that's
with
that.
that.
I can't. That's the only time I will question your blackness when you want to disassociate from it in favor of someone else's culture and then downgrade your own community. That right there is
there's a difference between holding your community accountable and doing what you said. Like when you just separate from your community and start like putting it on the bottom of the pedestal. I can understand admiring another culture, right?
Exactly.
I can understand that, right? But trying to completely separate yourself from your culture, your community, and then put it like subpar, that's wild to me. Keenan, real quick, I don't know, you might want to edit this out. I'm going to give Keith an opportunity to answer. Like, so we're going to keep that in mind. Is Bunny...
No, you might want to edit it out.
I might want to edit it. All right, I'll tell you. Here we go. So, like, is bunny hopping leaving the black community? Does that make you... Let me not say leaving the black community.
Just had
Bunny...
to ask.
I had to ask because I was curious.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm going to share my perspective as well, right? Only reason I say that because, you know, it went viral. Dr. Umar went viral with it.
Yes, he did. He certainly did.
Does bunny hopping not make you black enough?
No. Because here's my thing with that whole debate that he had with that gentleman. First off, let me say this. We had black people married to other black people that had black children that sell us out all day, every day. So by way of that statement, is it a case of if you marry someone black and you're with someone black, you are more likely to be loyal or you are more loyal?
You asking me?
Yeah.
All right, yeah, we're going to lead this in because you're going to like my... All right, okay, here we go. I'm going to say this. Okay. I'm going to be honest with you. I agree with the perception of... I struggle with believing how down you are for the cause if your spouse is not black. I'm not saying that you can't go out and love who you want to love.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that, but what he said in that podcast, I see the validity in it. When you marry somebody, you are marrying into their belief, their family, and their culture.
But that also works vice versa.
I agree with you. It does work vice versa. However, on the grand scale of things, it tends to favor one group at the detriment of the other.
See, my issue with that statement that he has, that he made with that regard, and I get what you're getting at, is, you know me, I'm one of those people where it's kind of like, okay, so where's the dad to support that?
Yeah, you could, fair enough. You can say we're the data to support that, and I don't have that right now. But I will say this. This will be my rebuttal to that. There's only two groups of people. When we press marrying inside your group, they get flack for it. They get poo-poo thrown at them. Yeah. When white people say that, they're labeled as racist. Yeah. When black people say that, they tell us you gotta love everybody. Those are the two groups. Like when those two groups push marrying within your own race, they get stuff thrown their way. When other groups of people push that narrative, nothing gets thrown their way at all. When Chinese people push for Chinese people to marry one another, when Nigerians push for Nigerians to marry one another, when Italians push for Italians to marry one another, there's no issue with that. Yeah. All right. When black people push for it, we get the whole you're supposed to love who you want to love.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on that?
I can only speak from my experience.
Go right ahead.
I've never gotten that.
You've never...
I've never gotten that.
Okay, fair enough.
I've never gotten that. Honestly, it's a case of the places that I've been and the people that I've been around, it's always been, whether it was spoken or mostly unspoken, it's always been this thing of you're gonna marry someone black, or you're gonna be with someone black if you are black. It's never been a case of like, oh, you gotta love everybody. It's just a case of like, we automatically assume you're gonna be with someone black. And I think that to say, to Dr. Johnson's point, well, not to his point, against his point actually, to say that, well, because I want to make sure I'm quoting him correctly, but I probably won't. Long story short, questioning loyalty by way of marrying someone white to your own community, to me, is kind of crazy for the simple fact that, again, I don't necessarily know how you lose your blackness or how you lose the protection or celebration of your blackness just by way of marrying someone outside of your race.
I agree with that. I don't think that
because essentially, and again, this is my interpretation. I feel as though in making that type of statement, because it goes back to your topic, it's kind of like, okay, so now you're trying to tell someone that they're not black enough.
Fair enough. I don't think it makes you less black when you marry outside your race. I do want to say that. I don't think it makes you less black, but I can see the validity in his statement and I don't want to speak for him.
Yeah.
But as someone who's listening on the outside of what he's saying, I can see why someone will question the validity of, well, how far deep into the struggle are you willing to go to fight for your people? Because let's say you have a white wife, and I'm not saying it's not possible, right? But at a certain point, when you're fighting for your community, when you're fighting for the black community, you're going to offend the perception of reality or the mindset of white people. Because you're basically going to be calling them out on, yes, you are responsible for the way racism plays out today. There's no way around it, right?
Yeah.
Like, for instance, yes, to a certain level, white people are responsible for racism today because you maintain it. If you're not speaking out against it, all right?
Yeah.
And if you're not trying to take steps to change it or educate yourself about it, then you're maintaining it and you're benefiting from it.
Okay.
So real quick.
Continue.
So as you go further into that cause of fighting for people, it does lead the question, how far are you going to fight? Because you got to go home to that person.
Yeah.
And if that person isn't 100% in support of what you're doing, that's going to be a tough conversation. And that tough conversation you're going to have, is that conversation going to hinder how you go forward with carrying the banner of black people? Like, are you going to keep championing this banner?
Yeah.
Or at some point, because of that conversation with your spouse, you're going to start to pull that banner in a little bit? I just wanted to say that I could see how someone could question the validity of, which I think is what he's getting at, how far into this fight can you go? Because you got to go home.
Yeah.
Like, brother, sister, you got to go home.
Okay, I'm trying to stick to the merits of this argument because the fact that when I watched that podcast, that interview on the Joe Budden podcast, I don't really want to share that thought, so I'm going to keep that to myself.
That's fine. While you keep that, I do want to say that I don't think it makes you less black, but I can see the validity because I want to make sure people understand me clearly because we have clients that we help, and I don't want nobody to think that we won't, or that Dr. Brown won't be able to help certain people.
Yeah.
I'm saying that I can see the validity in questioning how far you're willing to go when it comes to this struggle.
I'll put it to you this way. That is something I think that there has to be a skepticism across the board then. If it was a case of he used that example and then other ones, I could respect it. Because the simple fact that, again, one of my favorite quotes, just because they kin to you don't mean they're a friend to you. Because there's a lot of people who look just like you and me that will be the first ones who sell us out quickly. So I feel as though in having that particular topic or that discussion, if he focused on like, look, that's a broad thing, I could respect it. But he spoke to his particular bias, which is interracial couples.
Right, that is his bias, yes.
And what also made me frustrated during that podcast, he had the audacity to ask the gentleman, so how does you dating a white woman benefit the black community? Like, so you're saying that one's personal life, all of it has to completely benefit the black community?
I can't speak for him in that regard, and I see where you're coming from. I think that from the things that I've heard him share is that every black couple, by and large, impacts the black community. Every black person, by and large, impacts the black community with the decision that they make. So when you decide, and keep in mind, I'm speculating on what his thoughts are, okay? I'm speculating.
Yeah.
Because he often says that marriage he equates it to a business agreement.
Which is funny because he said the complete opposite in that podcast. But go ahead.
I haven't seen the entire podcast.
No, he says that romance. Well, not marriage. I take that back. He said romance. Romance is
a byproduct of opportunity and some
intention.
other stuff. And intention, right? Yeah. So therefore, business is an intention. It's an opportunity with intention.
But the funny thing is him going on a tangent about that because, again, I'm not sure if he heard the gentleman. He's just dating a white woman.
No, I thought he said he married her.
He said he was dating. He has a white girlfriend.
He has a white girl. Oh, okay. I thought he said that was his
So
wife.
which kind of confused me when we went on this tangent about marriage, which I don't know why the gentleman that he was talking to didn't just say, like, no, I didn't say I was married to her. I said I'm dating her.
I got you.
It just kind of threw me. But again, ladies and gentlemen, I will, because me and my brother have this joke, and I'm not bashing Dr. Umar Johnson, because I will say this. He does have some points I do agree with.
Hey, I agree.
I will also be 100% honest and take ownership of the fact that when Dr. Umar Johnson speaks, I come to it with a little bit of reservations, only because of, and I'll keep that to myself, because some of the things that he says, for me, they lack a certain context, or they're being viewed through a certain lens that he's trying to apply for all black people when it just does not make sense.
Let's say that for the next episode.
Yes.
All right. So we hope you got something out of this conversation with Dr. Brian, Dr. Keith, For Us Therapeutics. Like I always say, like, comment, subscribe, and share. Come back next time to hear another podcast from us.